Hey everyone, it's LS, and I'm joined here by C9's top laner, Fudge, aka the Fudge Factor. This is going to be my first ever interview. We're just going to sort of see how it goes and just how it ends up turning out. Fudge, how are you doing so far? You have your quarterfinals match actually coming up in a few days.
Yeah, I have a quarterfinals match against Gen G in like 3 days or 4 days.
Yep.
And it's gonna be a lot of fun. It's gonna be versing Nemesis's team. It's gonna be gonna have to destroy Mr. Generation Gaming.
Yeah. I mean, okay, so you got here. How I mean, how are you feeling about actually getting to quarterfinals, and what are you feeling like are some of the events that actually allowed this to occur? I mean, getting out of Group A, no one really forecast that to happen, and yet it did.
Um, I would say so. Yeah, obviously we made it out of play-ins, which was expected of us. We're like NA third seed, although we are NA third seed, we are a major region, so it's expected of us to make it out of play-ins. And then going into Group A, everyone expected us to basically just uh, come forth, and everyone thought it would be Damwon FPX at the top. No one really knew if Damwon or FPX would be the first seed, but everyone expected them to be the top two for sure. And uh, I would say a lot of the reason why we were able to make it out was because FPX sort of just flopped, and I don't know exactly what's going on behind the scenes with them, but it seems like they just didn't play up to like the same level that they did during LPL. Um, and they made a lot of really coin flip decisions in games that allowed us to win games and take one or two games off of them, and even get a lot of leads in early game against them. Even though the players are generally very pretty good at laning phase, relative to us.
So, I mean, that's something I was actually thinking about watching Worlds this year. So you mentioned that they didn't play up to the level that they were doing inside of LPL, but a lot of people would also probably say that NA are overperforming relative to the expectations that everyone had for NA, right? So a lot of people when they watch teams in various regions, what are they really watching? What are they really looking at? So do you actually think that it is that they didn't live up to the level of LPL, or do you think that all of the hype generated around LPL or pretty much any region in general, both for good and bad, right? Teams, everyone
Mm-hmm.
watches NA, everyone, they shit on it. They say it's really bad. The gameplay is really bad. International events come just like MSI, and you guys are pushing Eastern teams in games. You're legitimately pushing
Yep,
them and threatening to take games. So do you
yep.
actually think it's that these teams aren't living up to the level, or is it that the perception of competitive league is actually detached by the public?
Yeah, I would say a lot of it is the public uh, seems to overemphasize how good the LPL teams are, the LCK teams are, and sort of ignore their mistakes. Whereas they ignore the good parts of NA and EU and sort of uh, overemphasize their mistakes. Um, and a lot of it is just narrative, to be honest. If you actually watch the games of LCK and LPL and go through it, they're definitely better than the Western teams. However, they still make a lot of the same drafting errors, itemization errors. I would say actually the Eastern teams make way more itemization errors. Um, and they don't really seem to have a lot more thought to their gameplay than the Western teams. I do think that they're much better mechanically, and that is the main thing that allows them to sort of just beat the Western teams. A lot of it is just laning mechanics, understanding of damage, um, a lot of different uh, things that aren't necessarily to do with the strategic part of the game that they sort of just beat the Western teams at. Whereas I do think that makes it pretty coin flip, honestly. When we beat the Eastern teams, it's a very um, I would say it's very hmm, it's very hard to predict when we beat them and when we lose to them because it doesn't seem like a lot of teams play around this champions very well.
So, I mean, interestingly, one of the things that you're talking about is something that I think a lot of people don't take into consideration. But when you're playing in a best of one format, even a best of three or best of five, there's a limited amount of situations that can actually occur in a game, right? This is nothing to do with necessarily just League of Legends, right? You're saying how much mechanically better they are, but their ability to exercise or showcase that inside of a game isn't possible to really show on a large scale unless you have an extremely large sample size that would allow people
Yeah.
to witness that, which is why I think a lot of people refer to Korean solo queue and even the Chinese solo queue, right, where they can showcase that over dozens and dozens or hundreds of games when people visit. So, do you feel like the lack of emphasis or the lack of ability to exercise those edges does allow for Western teams to contend with them as time goes by?
Yeah, I would say that they put themselves generally in pretty bad positions, champions wise, and also the decisions they make in game don't really allow their mechanics to actually show, or the difference in ability to show. Um, and basically, they don't seem to have this a very good understanding of how their champion should play. And I don't think that's actually a big gap with them and Western teams. Um,
Would you say
and
Western
I'm not.
teams maybe know more?
Go ahead. Um, I think it's hard to say they know more, but I think we seem to put more of an emphasis on the strategic part of the game rather than the mechanical part of the game, whereas they seem to be putting more of an emphasis on the mechanical part of the game, at least from the outside.
Okay. And I mean, what do you think causes all of this? Because Western teams, they have a lot of hurdles to actually overcome, right? They have the solo queue environments. If you're in an A, you have ping issues, you have scrim issues. Some teams are only playing 5 scrim games a day, right? And then if they try to queue up
Yeah.
for solo queue, you can't actually get a lot of solo queue games in. This leads to less practice on champions, and it leads to just a lack of effectiveness when it comes to actually practicing. But Eastern teams don't have these issues, right? They have their solo queue.
Yeah.
Some of them have 2, 3, 4 scrim blocks, right? And obviously in Europe, things are going to be a little bit different than North America. But what do you think leads to this, or do you think that's the contributing factor where the West relies on more strategical components to make up for a lack of ability to practice mechanical components?
I definitely think that in the West, um, we definitely have to rely on the strategic side of the game to actually beat the Eastern teams. Uh, the amount of practice they get, the amount of other people that also have the same amount of skill at them when it comes to this sort of mechanical ability. It's really not on the same level in the West, so we definitely look for different ways to win the game. And I would say that allows us to sort of overcome the. I wouldn't say overcome because I would definitely still say that the Eastern teams in general are better. Um, but I think it allows us to sort of get games and get like 1 or 2 wins or 3 wins against the Eastern teams. Whereas if we were to play, say, 100 games, I think that we would probably lose like 80% of them.
Okay. And I mean, one of the immediate thoughts that I have, especially watching this year's Worlds, is why now, right? Why now at MSI do the Eastern teams bleed? Why at Worlds 2021 are Eastern teams bleeding? Do you think that Eastern region teams are progressing slower than Western teams now due to the aforementioned emphasis that they have on just mechanics rather than strategy? Or do you think that there's something else that's causing them to be stagnant? Or do you just not even think that they're stagnant and something else is at play?
Um, I would definitely say that Western teams seem to be less stagnant when it comes to itemization, what champions are good, the overall idea of what champion strengths are. I would definitely say that Western teams have actually a better idea. Um, but I do think that there are certain champions that the Eastern teams play better, which makes it seem a lot stronger in their hands. But for example, like Graves Top, which is very, very popular now at Worlds, this was already being talked about by you, Nemesis, and I was already like, I played it in lock-in one time, and I didn't play it ever again, but nothing actually really changed about Graves. The champion is the same champion, but it seems like once Eastern teams get their hands on it, they make it look very strong, whereas Western teams aren't able to execute it as well. But it does seem like these ideas come faster to Western teams. At least not Western teams. I would say Western people like yourself and Nemesis.
And I mean, what do you think contributes to this? I mean, obviously, there is a gap, right, that exists. For instance, Western players generally tend to stay away from Fiora, or they tend to stay away from Aurelia, they tend to stay away from these mechanical monster champions, but Eastern teams obviously have an affinity for them because their solo queue environments, practice environments allow for these champions to flourish, backed up by that emphasis on mechanics. And so do you think that there's more champions that Western teams actually look down upon, don't consider, and all these other things due to a lack of ability to foresee what's possible without it already being in front of their eyes?
I would definitely say that if every Eastern team was playing Fiora, all the other Western teams would be trying to play it themselves. But the problem is that there are certain Eastern teams that play it well, and others that don't really touch it. And a lot of the time, the West sort of needs almost like confirmation from the Eastern teams to actually sort of start to play the champions that are actually good. For example, Fiora, I don't think that anyone outside of the Chinese or Korean teams can actually play it well. And although it actually isn't being played a lot right now, it's definitely very strong. And it seems like no one's really going to be able to play it until someone from the Eastern team starts to popularize it, which is similar thing to what happened with Graves and Trinomir, because although Graves and Trin were already being talked about within the Western scene, no real Western pro player was playing it, so therefore it never really looked good in the West's eyes. And now that the Eastern teams are playing it, everyone's like, yeah, it's really good, and you should start playing it now and copy how they play the champion, basically.
And why do you think this is? Why do you think that it takes an Eastern player to play a champion that is demonstrably strong in isolated incidences that you can actually find, whether in scrims or solo queue, but it takes someone from the East to begin playing it before people will hop on the train? Even champions that have been very strong but didn't again start getting picked up again until Worlds, such as something like Yuumi.
It seems like the West has, I wouldn't say a mental block, but they have the belief that the East knows better. And I think a lot of teams have this belief that because we have in the entire like history of League of Legends, except for the first couple seasons, sort of just got stomped by the Eastern teams, we have the belief that if they're not doing it, they must know something we don't. And I think that belief sort of restricts the creativity of a lot of the teams. And you go ahead.
No, I mean it strikes me a little bit weird, right? Earlier on in this interview, you mentioned that the Eastern teams seem to be strategically impaired through visible things, right? That you can point out, whether it be itemization errors or draft, right? And now we're at this point where you're referencing that a consensus is that in the West, Eastern teams are just thought of being more correct. So do you think that there's something going on there, or what is it?
I would say that a lot of the time when the West plays against the East in international events, at least in the past, when you play certain champions against them and then you lose with it, a lot of people use that as a sort of argument to say that the champion's bad, because if they were to say that the champion's still good and I'm still losing, that would a lot of the time just hurt your ego. And
Okay.
you have a belief that you're very good when you're a pro player a lot of the time. So admitting that someone is just straight up better than you and that it's not a champion is usually very hard for a lot of professionals. Uh, and there's a lot of results-based analysis, I would say, that happens, especially within the Western scene, where if you lose with a champion, we sort of attribute the loss to a champion with a disregard of the actual execution of what you could have done in the game to
Okay.
change, uh, to reasonably change the outcome.
And so while we're on the topic of champions and everything else that's going on, we're going into quarters now at Worlds. We finished group stages, play-ins played out. It seemed like the meta in play-ins was a lot more wide open than it was once we got to group stages, and it seems like the more the tournament goes on, the tighter and tighter the actual meta is becoming in terms of drafts and champions being picked. And there's been certain people that have been very vocal about champions that are absent that would be proper responses to champions that are starting to pop their heads up in the meta or just endlessly cycling. So do you feel like the meta has maybe regressed since play-ins, or what do you think is actually going on?
So I think during play-ins, what happened was everyone came like a week before the tournament started, and all the different regions came, like
Yeah.
many different regions came and started scrimming against each other, and it's sort of just a mix of all the champions that everyone thought was good within these games. And now that the tournament has extended, a lot of the teams have started to sort of just copy what the winning teams do. And a lot of what the winning teams do were playing Graves, they were first picking Yumi, playing Lucian Nami, playing Aphelios, playing LeBlanc, Ryze, TF, all of these things. So that's why this is basically like the main champions you see now, because a lot of the other team's mentality, the losing team's mentality, is that we need to play what the winning teams are playing, and that seemed to be how the meta has changed or evolved during Worlds. Whereas at the start, during play-ins, everyone was just like playing what they thought was good, and there was no real like idea of what the winning team played, because there really wasn't a winning team at the start of everything.
And do you think that part of this is attributed to the aforementioned ego concept that you mentioned earlier, where just because the teams are winning, it means that people don't want to admit that it's their own shortcomings, and so they just begin copying?
I would say it's definitely partly that, but also um, people. I would say it's definitely ego, but it's also that people sort of just use uh, a sort of confirmation bias that they win a lot of games on this champion, so it must be good, or they think that the team that they're losing to knows something they don't, so then they'll play it and try to figure out what they know that we don't, um, and then that leads them to playing the same champions as the winning team.
Okay, and so do you believe that the current meta and pool of champions that we're seeing in group stages and possibly going to continue seeing again even in quarters, do you think it's a reflection of champions' current power level in League of Legends? Or is it a byproduct of the enclosed environment that the Iceland scrims are producing?
I definitely wouldn't say that it's representative of the power level of the champions, mainly because a lot of the time, how Worlds teams draft is basically they pick champions that they're comfortable on, wherever, with almost a disregard for the enemy champions. And if there was some sort of regard, like for example, um, a team wouldn't pick Kennen into Jarvan, something like this, right? But many people do still do the same thing, where like a team first picks Aphelios, but then they respond with uh, Lee Sin, or they respond with Renekton, um, and it's almost like they just pick champions that they feel are strong rather than trying to counter what the enemy team picks. Um, and when someone picks champions in poor positions for what the champion wants to do, it makes a champion look a lot weaker than if you were to pick it in a correct position, um, which then doesn't really show what a champion can actually do. It sort of just shows what a champion looks like when it's at its worst, or when it's at its best if you're being picked in a position that's really that where you like blind pick something and then the enemy team picks something really bad into it.
Okay, and so this responsiveness to drafting, a lot of people throughout time in League of Legends has always sort of held the belief that blue side is just better because you get access to things first, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have first pick inside of the draft phase, but what you're describing should actually be counterintuitive to that, right? Where you want to be on red side because you're constantly reacting.
Mm-hmm. I would definitely say that red side, if drafting with players that are able to play a lot of different champions, is much easier to draft with, but also it sort of traps enemies into not being able to pick many champions on first pick or on 2-3, for example, on blue side, where if they were to pick certain champions and the enemy players have a lot of different champions in their arsenal, it feels very restrictive, and no team in competitive right now drafts like this. No team really responds to what their enemy is picking. They sort of just pick what they feel is strong in the current meta. So it's definitely very hard to see from like a public or an outsider's perspective. But when playing against teams that do pick so many different counter picks to your champion, red side definitely feels very oppressive.
Okay, and I mean, you said no teams are doing this. Does that include Cloud9?
Yeah, I would definitely say that we're also not good at drafting against what the enemy picks, but we'd rather just play what we're comfortable in. And I think it's almost something we've already accepted now, where we don't really pick the best champion. Rather, we pick the champion that we're comfortable playing, that we're comfortable we can actually execute on.
And do you feel like it has to be that way?
I don't think it has to be that way, but because now, at Worlds, it feels like you sort of just need to put band-aid fixes onto underlying problems. Um, that's sort of just what we decided on. And I think a lot of different teams have the same mentality, where there might be a lot of big problems or underlying problems that people just put band-aid fixes on, and that's one of ours.
All right. And I mean, would you say that any team in the world really drafts well?
No, I don't think any team drafts really well from a theoretical standpoint. And I would definitely not say that any team has a very clear strength in draft. And no team's really very consistent with how they draft or seem to have very obvious, I guess, measurements for what a good draft is. It seems like any team sort of it's very random how teams draft. It seems based on how they feel about certain champion picks or strengths or maybe even win rates or something like that.
Okay, and I want to bring up something before we move on. This is actually a conversation I think I had with you during one of the World's live viewings, where you had mentioned that even though there were teams with losing drafts or weaker or more vulnerable drafts, right? Having Twisted Fate would just skew things because teams weren't playing well enough in order to resist Twisted Fate or play against him. And so you were seemingly referring to this thing where the draft is actually weaker, but the teams can't play around this, and so Twisted Fate's actually just making the draft almost imbalanced.
Yeah, I would say that this is also one of the reasons why like TF and Rise are so popular, is because many players don't seem to be able to track the enemy champions on the map very well, and they find it hard to predict what will happen within the next minute or so in the game, for various different reasons depending on the player. But not many players seem to play very well around these like global spells, although they're not fully global. Um, uh, and these sort of just punish mistakes very well, where a lot of teams are just making a lot of mistakes in general. So champions that can punish these mistakes, like TF and Rise, flourish a lot.
Okay. And I mean, moving on, right, into coming up into quarterfinals, right? So we'll move on here. Do you expect that the meta in quarterfinals is going to be any different from group stage?
I don't. I really don't think so. It feels like right now in scrims, no teams are really innovating. It feels like the same recycled picks, the same trades and drafts where like you're trading OP champs, quote unquote. So it's like it doesn't really feel like there's going to be much innovation. Obviously, we'll end up having to see, but uh, I really think that it should be expected to see the same sort of meta from groups going into quarters.
All right. I mean, moving into quarters, as we talked about really early on, you guys pulled Generation Gaming, which, some people refer to this matchup as seventh versus eighth, is what is
Okay,
going
buddy.
on. Now, how are you feeling about that matchup? Do you think that Cloud9 is favored in it in terms of odds, or where is everything for you?
Honestly, I really just think it's a coin flip. And the reason why I think it's a coin flip is mainly just because um, right now everyone seems to just fight randomly, sort of regardless, or not taking into account their champions or what their comps want to do or what the enemy comp wants to do. And a lot of games are just coin flips from early game. Like for example, our games against FPX have been uh, sort of in our favor because a lot of the time they just take really coin flip fights that their comp don't really want to take. Um, or they die to like certain ganks that are like very obvious for no real reason. Um, so it's like, and it's not like just FPX is doing it. It feels like every single team in Worlds, other than I guess you could say T1 and Dam1, are making a lot of these really poor, obvious errors. So it feels to me that if Gen G make those errors, and we're playing correct champions to be able to punish these errors and then end up winning the game, which could definitely happen, uh, or vice versa, where we're making these errors and they're playing champions that can capitalize on them. It feels like it can sort of just go anywhere.
Do you feel like this will be a long series, or do you think whoever ends up getting the edges early on will probably just close it?
Um, Honestly, if I had to predict, it's probably just going to be a quick series because to me it seems like, I mean, I know that we seem to, um, I mean, actually, I don't know if that's true. Now that I think about it, I think it might actually just be a long series because we tend to be, as a team, pretty inconsistent, and it seems like every best of five we sort of play goes pretty long, um, or at least it goes to 4 games. It very rarely goes 3 games, other than I guess our EG series in playoffs. So I expect it to be pretty long. I think as a team we um, make a lot of really, really poor mistakes. And I think it's the same can be said for Gen G. So it's very likely a lot of the games will be very coin flip and it can sort of just go either way. And that's how I expect it. So um, honestly, 4 or 5 games is probably not that unlikely when it comes to us two teams.
All right. Well, I mean, we'll see what ends up happening for you, obviously, in quarters. And I mean, Fudge, you're going into quarter C9. NA made it out of groups and whatnot. A year ago, a lot of people didn't consider pretty much anything for you, right? You joined LCS, you did in the play-in. A lot of people had their remarks during play-ins, and then spring, MSI, summer, etc. What do you think were the most contributing factors for you, not even just this year, but leading up to this year and everything else that allowed you to be the player that you're at today? Because I mean, relative to most top laners in the West, I mean, you're certainly up there.
Um, I think a lot of players, at least in the LCS that I know about and that I've heard about, don't seem to come to very good conclusions. And I think a lot of it is because they're unable to question themselves as to um, why things are happening in the game, why they are good, why they are bad. Why did this happen? Why did we fight Herald? Is it good to fight Herald? What makes a fight at Herald good? Sort of a lot of different questions that you could sort of just go. You could go into a very, very deep rabbit hole basically when it comes to these questions. I don't think a lot of questions are very good. A lot of players are very good at asking themselves these questions, and I think um, when I came into basically just this year, um, from talking to you and Max, mainly you and Max, I would say, about asking yourself questions and sort of just questioning everything you even think about the game. Um, Sort of allowed me to come to, I think, better conclusions about how to play the game than other LCS players, and I think that allowed me to improve at a much faster rate than all the other LCS players. And I think it's very obvious when you watch my progression throughout the year that I'm much better now than during lock-in, for example. So I definitely think that I'm just a lot better at coming to conclusions or just thinking in general than other LCS players.
And do you feel like when you watch other LCS players, be it through an observer lens or ProView, that you can tell who is good and who isn't just by watching?
I think that when I watch certain players, I can tell that they have a thought behind what they do. Um, and it's very easy to tell when someone does something that lacks a reason. Uh, you can sort of just tell through their gameplay what they're thinking a lot of the time, or like what the reasoning behind like a certain click was, or a certain recall, or like when you're hard shaving a wave, stuff like this. It's very easy to tell what players are thinking in game based on where they're clicking, basically, and where they move their camera, uh, and a lot of like, sort of small, tiny things. Um, and I would definitely say that I could tell pretty quickly how good a certain player is relative to another, based on watching their preview.
All right. Well, I mean, I think that pretty much wraps it up. Hopefully, we'll be able to talk again, maybe post Worlds or whatnot, or I mean, we'll see what happens, right, with Gen G and what goes on there. After that, you might end up meeting EDG in the semis, and then things only continue to get progressively tougher. So unless this is Cinderella 9, it does not look too great. But
It is. It really is.
it is. LCS
It's definitely
20,
Cinderella 9.
yeah, 2022. I mean, do you think that NA this year at Worlds and everything else, do you think it's going to carry over at all into 2022 LCS?
What I worry is that because NA teams have seemingly done better this year, a lot of teams, and also public forget about all the problems that exist, and they sort of just forget about how forget about the problems, and they sort of just ignore it. And that's what I sort of worry for next year. And hopefully that doesn't happen, where teams are still willing to fix a lot of the issues, or um, even the league or Riot itself tries to fix a lot of these issues, which aren't necessarily always in the hands of the teams. Um, and yeah, basically, I think it's unlikely that. Honestly, I think it's like it's possible that next year we have similar results, um, but I don't think that this is a very consistent performance from NA to be able to make it out of groups relative to EU, LCK, and LPL. I think there's still definitely better regions than NA right now.
So do you think? I mean, this is the last question. Do you think EU is still greater than NA?
Um, I actually think that the EU teams at Worlds this year are worse, but I do think as a whole that EU is better than NA, and that's if you were to play all 10 teams in LEC versus all 10 teams in LCS, that all 10 teams in LEC would win over a very large sample size of games. But I definitely think it's very over-exaggerated how big the difference is between the two regions, and that I think that in the past, the gap was actually bigger than it is right now.
All right. And do you feel a difference between EU solo queue compared to NA?
Yeah, a lot of players seem to care a lot more, um, and that sort of just shows with how toxic they are, but also how even though they flame, they don't FF, and if they do FF, they still play the game if you don't if you vote no. And a lot of the time it's like, I mean, obviously this is very case dependent. Like there still will be like the AFKs and like the inters, but I do think that EU in general seems to just care more about the game, especially at the challenger level, where players are very they put a lot of like their emotional. I guess they invest a lot emotionally into the games and their like ranking, which in turn makes the games usually more competitive.
All right, well, there you have it, and that is going to wrap up the interview, Fudge. Thank you for obviously doing this, first one ever, and good luck against Generation Gaming.
Thank you very much, Mr. LS.